we are started here. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. We're calling this webinar Affordable High-Speed Internet for All, How Community Broadband Can Get Vermonters Connected. We're joined today by several representatives from Vermont's communication union districts to talk about this very important topic, getting all Vermonters connected to high-speed internet. We are joined today by FX Flinn from ECFiber. We have Evan Carlson from Nek Community Broadband and Jeremy Hansen from CVFiber, and many of you in the audience as well. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute here, but I wanted to provide some context for those who have joined the Zoom call and those who are watching on Facebook, and anybody who might be picking this up afterwards. It'll be on the VPIRG YouTube channel. It'll also be on our website for folks to watch later on. So for folks who maybe are coming for the first time, VPIRG has been hosting this webinar series for the last couple of months, basically since the start of the COVID crisis. And for the most part, the subject matter has been examining sort of the intersection between what has cropped up in the midst of the COVID crisis and traditional public interest issues. And internet connectivity is a big one that has cropped up as part of this. VPIRG, before any of this even started, has been very supportive of expanding broadband here in Vermont, bringing affordable high-speed internet to every Vermonter. And we've been particularly supportive of community broadband efforts. The primary reason being that we think community broadband is the way to actually achieve universal access. Community broadband as opposed to the large telecoms. If it was in the interest of the large telecoms to serve every Vermonter, regardless of how profitable it is, they would have done it by now or on their way to doing it, and that is not the case. So it's not just VPIRG that's recognized this. The state, through a lot of their policies, is starting to recognize this and empowering communities to take this issue on for themselves and deal with it. And we've been very supportive of that. And we also support community broadband because as a consumer protection organization, they also adhere to bedrock consumer protection principles. I mean, they tend to be, on average, more affordable, provide more reliable, higher speeds for customers, and they also adhere to bedrock principles like net neutrality, data privacy, and a lot of that comes from the fact that they don't necessarily have side businesses, community-owned broadband networks. Their mission, their North Star, is to get every person in their territory connected. They're not owning streaming services. They're not content creators, which is some of the things that vertical integration that has kind of caused some of the issues with net neutrality, data privacy, that sort of thing. So I don't know what all of our representatives feel about those particular issues, but I do know that all the folks on this call today do share the goal of getting every Vermonter connected to affordable high-speed internet. And most of them are, well, actually all of our guests today are representatives from communication union districts. And for anyone joining the call who doesn't know what a CUD or communication union district is, it's this special but simple and sort of magical entity that's allowed under Vermont law that is akin to a water district or a sewer district, which allows more than one town to come together to form a municipal entity for the purpose of building communications infrastructure. So there's a lot of good reasons to form a communications union district. I'm sure you'll hear about some of that and the thought process behind that today. VPIRG has been very supportive of the CUD model, and we'll talk a bit about that today. And I'll turn it over now to our guests to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the CUDs that they represent, the status of those. But just before I did that, I just wanted to actually offer a hearty thank you to not just them, but all the folks involved in CUDs. For folks that don't really realize, essentially we're talking about volunteers in a community coming together, dedicating their time and energy to put together a broadband network and get other folks in their community connected to the internet. So it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time. A lot of these people have other full-time jobs and they are devoting time to getting this up and running. So I want to start this out with just a hearty thank you to all of you. And then let's hear from you and what you've been up to. So maybe we'll start, and I guess maybe we'll go, at least for this round, in order of sort of CUD seniority. So we'll start with FX Flinn from ECFiber, then we'll go to Jeremy and Evan. But let us know who you are, a little bit about yourself, and a little bit about the history of your CUD and what you're all trying to do. So why don't we start with FX?
Sure, Zach, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this today. Well, first of all, for myself, I go by my initials, FX. That's for Francis Xavier, in case you didn't go to Catholic school. And I have been serving on the ECFiber board since 2012. But I well remember a town meeting in the town of Hartford in March of 2008 when I cast a vote to go into a contract with other towns in the East Central Vermont area to form an organization that would build out fiber to the premises throughout the towns that join that district. We are now, we've grown to 27 active towns in our area. We stretch from Windsor on the Connecticut River in the south up to Fairleigh on the Connecticut River in the north, and all the way to the eastern slope of the Green Mountains out in Rockingham and Granville. So and we cross multiple counties, and we have completed the build out of that network in about 75% of the premises that are either unserved or poorly served. And we hope to finish building out to all of those premises this year. And the only part of our district that will not be built will be the areas in the town of Hartford and the village of Woodstock that are presently served by Comcast. So it's going to be quite an accomplishment. And as for why it took 12 years, I will suffice it to say that we did not become a communications union district until January 1st, 2016. It was a subcommittee of ECFiber that actually drafted the original legislation. And so we have been trying to solve the problem of how to perform this task for a long time. And we are very gratified that it's working out. And we're very gratified that the state has adopted this, our model, as the model for succeeding in the rest of the state.
Excellent. And yes, I mean, ECFiber, they were the CUD model before CUDs even existed. As you mentioned, you didn't become a CUD until 2016 because it wasn't on the books until 2015. So thank you, FX. Jeremy, why don't you let us know about what you've been up to?
Sure. So CVFiber is a communications union district just to the north of ECFiber, very much trying to emulate the same model that FX was talking about. Our town meeting votes were about 10 years afterwards. So 2018 town meeting day, we had about a dozen towns in central Vermont, mostly in Washington County. And then we went on, added several more. So we are at 18 communities in Lamoille, Washington, and Orange counties. So we've been at this for a bit, and we're hoping to, to fulfill our mission of bringing universal high-speed broadband to everybody, starting with a construction project that we would hopefully begin engineering the end of this year. Kind of a couple different ways that we're thinking about, we're looking at funding it, which is a fair bit of it is up in the air, but I imagine we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, so we're rather young compared to ECFiber, but we are in regular contact with FX and Irv and the folks from ValleyNet who run ECFiber's network on a weekly or more basis, and we're definitely very happy to have their support and their mentorship as we go and we start building our own network here in central Vermont.
Great. And why don't we hear from Evan, who's coming to us from the Northeast Kingdom. Evan.
Hi, all. So I'm Evan Carlson. I'm the chair of the Nek Community Broadband CUD. We are absolutely the newest of the CUDs. We had our organizational meeting April 28th, so we are less than a month old from the official formation. We had 27 towns that voted on town meeting day to join the CUD in our region. And we in some of our early feasibility study work, we actually have some ideas on how we might actually scale to a 55 town CUD, which would really encompass all of Caledonia County, all of Essex and Orleans County as well. So it would set us up to be a very large organization, but we're also one of the most rural and certainly more economically deprived of the regions. So our initiative actually kicked off about 2 years ago with a feasibility study that was done by Vantage Point Solutions, really looking at the best way to get connectivity around Linden and the surrounding towns. The study explored a municipal electric, Lindenville Electric, actually operating a network, and ultimately they decided against that as an option just because they had capital projects that would keep them going for the foreseeable future, and didn't see or saw this as a kind of creep away from their core business. So the next best option was the creation of a communication union district, and so we quickly saw that there's a lot of appetite from other communities to be able to participate in this. And yeah, so town meeting day came, we had 27 towns that signed on and more lined up to go, and we just were awarded one of the broadband innovation grants from the Department of Public Service, and so we will be exploring some different business models, and hopefully, like CVFiber, getting some fiber laid in the next year.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate all the work that all of you are doing, and I think I should mention that a few other CUDs have formed. We were going to have Tim Scoggins from Southern Vermont Communication Union District on this. He unfortunately had to was unable to join at the last minute, but that also has formed in 2020, as well as Deerfield Valley CUD. And it is my understanding that there are talks and in the works for other regions of the state, I believe in Lamoille County, maybe Rutland County as well. And if there's actually a piece of legislation pending in the legislature right now that would allow, while this emergency is going on, for CUDs to be formed through select boards as opposed to the town meeting process, which may allow some more CUDs to come together in the months ahead. So I want to get into talking about the problem itself and CUD's role in the solution. So it's, I would say there's fairly widespread agreement that access to affordable high-speed internet is no longer a luxury, if it ever was actually a luxury, and it's truly a necessity that everybody should have. And if that wasn't really a unanimous opinion, it probably is closer to unanimous now after the last couple weeks than it probably ever has been. That said, we as a society, as a government, have not tackled this issue the same way we did, say, rural electrification. 23% of Vermonters don't have access to the federal definition of broadband, and that's based on provider data. So it likely or may actually be even higher than that. I mean, that's based on what existing providers are telling us. And we're nowhere near close to achieving our statutory goal of 100%, 100 by 2024. So what I'd like to hear from the folks on the call here is your take on how we've sort of arrived at this point. What is underlying this problem? Why don't Vermonters have universal access? I know that's sort of a big question, but then also, assuming you all think that CUDs have a role to play in solving this, and some of you have alluded to this already, and I assume you do think they have a role to play since you're part of CUDs, talking about what you see that role being and how that's incorporated. And before I ask, I will just note that I mentioned that these are all representative CUDs, but I think the answers and opinions they give today, as a blanket statement, would say we should ascribe to the individuals on the call. They may represent some of the opinions of your individual CUDs, but I think I want to respect and acknowledge that even within a CUD, there may be differences of opinion on certain aspects of this. So while you're here as representatives, I guess I would say the opinions you give today are your own for the purposes of this call. So why don't we'll just kind of like rotate this. So we started with FX last time. Why don't we go to Jeremy, and we'll kind of go around the wheel that way.
Sure. So, I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons that I think the CUD model is the right way forward is for those residents that aren't in very dense places. So the commercial interests will go to the places where they can find a profit. We are not constrained by finding a profit. So we have a mission, a community mission, and don't have to pay, you know, dividends or have a stock price. So with that, and also given that we can access a municipal bond market, we are a municipal entity, that can make the borrowing for our projects a bit cheaper. So that gives us a bit of an advantage, but we're also kind of like you said as in the introduction here, Zach, you know, I'm speaking for myself and in kind of broad strokes for CVFiber, but I have 18 delegates, you know, 18 towns, 18 delegates, and getting 18 people to agree on much of anything is that's a challenge. So we can get sentiments, but not, yeah, you certainly wouldn't want to try to edit a document with my whole board. And Evan, I really feel for you. You're talking about that number 55 and my head explodes thinking about your public meetings, Robert's rules and such. But because we're a public entity and we have to abide by the same sort of rules that a select board does, you know, we are open, we are accountable to the individual committees or individual communities on our committee. And we're, you know, the things that we are going to work on are going to be done in consultation with the communities and the people whom, you know, we are eventually providing service. So in that sense, I think we're poised to get those last few people at the end of that road that doesn't have a reasonable connection, you know, and have a bit more flexibility in our business model, because we still have to, you know, we still have to pay the bills at the end of the month. That was something that in the introduction that I don't know that was said, that we're not allowed to take taxpayer money. I mean, and we're not allowed to use the property tax capacity of our individual municipalities. So we're rather disconnected from our individual towns and cities that way, which has been appealing to a lot of our towns, because they, you know, they have enough on their plates, especially right now, to deal with highways and, you know, police and fire crews and whatnot. And they want to let us go off and do our own thing. And I think we can do that insulated from them and still eventually, like ECFiber has shown, still deliver a really, really high quality service that's necessary to the community.
Excellent. And Evan, do you want to dispute any of that or add on to that?
So I guess I would be a little bit more blunt about how we got here in saying that, in my eyes, it really represents a complete market failure. You know, we have kind of allowed the government and the lack of oversight from the government entities that are supposed to be making sure that our taxpayer dollars are spent efficiently and effectively, allowed them to just hand out massive amounts of taxpayer dollars to provide internet service that, you know, really is only going to kind of bolster the coffers of these private providers. You know, there's not much accountability, or they claim it's accountable, but it's not really accountability for the providers in our region. And, you know, in some cases, it's really at a detriment to community organizations like ours that are really strapped with trying to fill out the last mile of our communities. You had mentioned rural electrification, and, you know, that was something that this is different, but actually what's funny is that it's not different if you look 100+ years ago when, you know, there was Victory, Vermont, which didn't actually have service and probably never would have got service if it wasn't for the RUS. And so I think that kind of government mandate is the type of thing that might be needed to really ensure that there is connectivity across every community in our country. And I don't know if every community in rural America is going to be able to have the grassroots initiatives that we see here in Vermont kind of spur up and take a lead on these initiatives. I think for us, you know, our role, we believe in this idea of kind of the homegrown solution to the problem, having it be a community-led initiative, as you had mentioned in the beginning, community-owned assets that really are helping develop skills and build a network that is actually a part of the community. I personally think that, you know, that high-speed internet is one piece of this, but it's much more than that. It's really also about job creation and circulating dollars and trying to make sure that it's a part of our local economy. And when we are having organizations that are based or headquartered outside of Vermont, we don't have that deep connection with our providers. Yes, there's people that are in our community that are hired by them, but when you have an organization that really has a sense of community ownership, it changes how it's operating. So I think that that is absolutely core to what I would like to see in our CUD, and it seems that that's the case with organizations like ECFiber, who has successfully built a network in our rural communities. So.
Thanks for that. And speaking of ECFiber, FX, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. The whole being central to local economy, the community, being answerable to the community. I mean, ECFiber has a track record with that, and the role there.
Well, and it's a hard won track record. I think that the audience should all understand that right now, ECFiber has borrowed $42 million in the municipal bond market that we are paying off from revenue that we take in from our customers. And I, for one, am very glad that we have no involvement with local property tax-backed bonds, because in an environment like this, getting taxpayers in 23 or 27 or 28 towns to all vote yes on the same bond, it would be extraordinary. And so we're free of that. And we have as long as we can present a business plan and a demonstration of our ability to operate a business profitably enough to repay those loans, we can take them out to the extent that we need them. I think by the end of the day, we're probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 or $60 million. Now, it's quite possible that because of the current crisis, there'll be some federal funding that in the form of direct grants that will take that down. That'll be great. So then we're able to do it for less. So we're able to pay the loans off faster. We're able to get more people hooked up. Well, at a certain point, we will be profitable enough that we can consider bringing our rates down. And this goes, again, to the affordability issue, because there are people out there that ECFiber goes past their house, or goes past their manufactured home, and they cannot afford to get hooked up. It's not because they can't afford the $100 hookup. It's because they can't afford the $2,000 conduit trenching that is required, or it's because even if they were hooked up, they just can't afford $72 a month, and that's a real issue. And our board has been discussing for the last year, would there be a way for us to develop some kind of program where we would be able to subsidize the costs of families who we know are in economic distress, either because their children qualify for the reduced or free lunch program, or through other means. And I am hoping that ECFiber will be able to announce an initiative along these lines later this summer. We do have some plans in the work. But as I said to our delegates at our meeting earlier this month, the single thing that they can do best right now is to get out there and identify why people we could serve haven't taken our service. Because the more people who take our service in our area, the sooner we will get to a point where we can begin reducing rates across the board. Because what are we going to do if we make a big profit, right? We don't have shareholders, so we can lower the we can lower the cost.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and I had the affordability question, the specific affordability question, a little further down, but let's go to it now since you bring it up, and I'd be interested to bring Jeremy and Evan in on this. But when we talk a lot, especially like at the policy level about access, and even the numbers that we talk about, we say 77% of Vermonters have access to the federal definition of broadband 25.3, setting aside whether or not they actually do have that capability. That just means that 77% of Vermont addresses have the technology for 25.3 running by their house. It does not actually mean that 77 Vermont addresses currently are getting that internet. And if they can't afford it, they're not getting it. So I think there's a lot of people in that 77% that would be surprised to learn that they are considered served, because from their perspective, if they cannot afford and are not getting high-speed internet, they're not served. They don't have that service in their home. They're unable to do telehealth or do video conferencing or do remote learning. So affordability, I think, is such a key or critical part of this. And I guess I'd ask Jeremy and Evan, who are kind of in the midst of being part of like planning for bringing a network online, how much that is kind of coming up in your discussions, what that's centered around, and are there things even from a policy standpoint that we could be doing to impact or help that? So why don't we go to Evan first, and then Jeremy on that.
Sure. So I mean, as you mentioned, Zach, we're still early in this planning stage, but the idea that we could offer potentially gigabit speeds at some point really isn't going to make a difference for those folks that can't necessarily afford to pay for it. So that is absolutely something that's front of mind in town meeting day and select board meetings that I attended. That was one of the number one questions we got. What does affordable mean? How much is the service actually going to cost? Followed up by when are we going to get it, of course. So I think, when we think about what affordability looks like, there's certainly, trying to have something that's comparable to DSL or some of the other fixed wireless solutions. But we think that there's, aside from just getting a robust network and a lot of subscribers on it, we think that there's a lot of opportunities for partnerships and looking at ways to be able to potentially lease strands of fiber and hopefully develop some other streams of revenue that will allow us to be able to reduce the cost of our service and for the end user. But it's still so early in the planning stages that it's hard to say what our final costs are.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because, in some of these, it's just like, well, can we get the infrastructure built to even have this be a possibility and then figure it out, because there's just so much to this. But Jeremy, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this as well.
Well, yeah, and so piggybacking on what you just said, I mean, you still have to build the network. The network still costs stuff. You still have to pay your technicians and your customer service and your accountants. So, I mean, you still have to have a business model that's sustainable. And the way ECFiber has gone about it, the way I understand it, is that they've established themselves. They've essentially gotten towards the end of their building and their construction, and now they can look at. They don't have to, now that they don't have to take as many loans out every year, they can look at plowing some of the, some of the cream off the top back into the communities in various ways. It could be affordability, like FX was talking about, or something else. But this is something that we're thinking about too. I think, for better or worse, CVFiber and the other CUDs that are newer to the game, we kind of came in at a time when the state and the federal government are maybe taking it a bit more seriously. So we may be able to avail ourselves of grant money that ECFiber at a similar point was not able to take advantage of. So if we're able to have, let's say, 20% of our capital costs covered by a grant, or maybe more, well, all of a sudden, what worked in ECFiber's books may actually be, across the board, less expensive. Alternatively, rather than going that route, we could try to stay at something like ECFiber's price point and then offer a sort of an averaged out of affordable option, to folks who are, getting SNAP benefits or the same, any sort of state aid. There's nothing preventing us from doing that and sort of just spreading those costs across all of the subscribers. So we haven't worked out exactly what that looks like, but that we've definitely 100% talked about how we might structure our rate structure. And actually, this is a conversation we'll be having in the next month or two, as we have our consultant building a business plan, so that we can go and after that grant money and after that loan money and actually proceed with the actual stringing of fiber on poles.
So you mentioned grant money. I mean, for so much of this, funding is the name of the game. Funding could play a role in what makes these networks ultimately affordable. I mean, every dollar that the government or other entity can provide can go a long way. So I do want to talk a little bit about both the challenges and I guess the opportunities that are out there for these networks as you're trying to get your footing, get started. The state last year enacted Act 79 that had in it some, a revolving loan fund, established a broadband specialist with the Department of Public Service. So certain bits of help, as you were, for the CUDs, and there are a smattering of existing federal programs, although there are maybe difficulty in accessing some of that funding. So I'd be interested for you all to talk about and describe some of those programs, some of what you're looking at as name of the game. How do we fund these networks? How do we get them built? And where you're at with that? And to the extent there are challenges, what you would maybe like to see at the state policy level, or what kind of help could be given to make this easier to accelerate your operations and start building this infrastructure. So why don't we go back to FX on that? You're all at different stages in this process as well. I mean, ECFiber, an existing network. So it'd be interesting to hear with everyone at sort of different stages of the game how you're going about that.
I would just say, for example, we just admitted 4 new towns. We have not done any of the poll data collection. We haven't contracted with design and engineering. And it's not like we can jump right on that because we've got quite a number of things to do beforehand. Now, if we were to get a grant, of $1 million that we could target at all those pre-building costs, and we could jump on that, we could use that money and jump on that now. Yeah, that could make a difference. Does that fit into a use of the funding that the state has just received in the CARES Act? Probably not. But we do think that there is something that we could spend money on that does fit in the CARES Act, and that is putting in that conduit into trailer parks, putting in that conduit into folks who are in an economically distressed situation. And I've been working very hard with a lot of other people around the state in a lot of other situations, taking a look at the Emergency Broadband Action Plan, looking at the way it proposes to spend some of those monies, and trying to come up with some specific pricing to encourage the state to simply start spending money. Just, if people are poor and you want them not to be poor, give them money. If your state needs broadband built out and it's going to take money, start spending the money, because there are things that we can do now. There are things we can spend money on now that we really don't need to wait for all the T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted in 4 or 5 different plans. We know, for example, that all the poles on some state roads up in the Northeast Kingdom are going to have fiber on them. So have the power company do the make-ready work. Have the phone company do the make-ready work. Just give them some money to do that work. And We'll sort it all out when we actually go about doing the build. So this has been my consistent message for the last month is let's go. Let's find things we can spend money on now. We're smart enough and we know enough. We've got enough experience to know what these things are. And I am hoping that we'll see some action along those lines, you know, in the coming weeks.
Thanks for that. And you mentioned the Emergency Broadband Action Plan. For any folks in the audience who don't know, the Department of Public Service on May 5th issued a draft Emergency Broadband Action Plan, which FX mentioned. I don't think I'll cover every detail of that here, although I would encourage, if you're somebody who's interested in this topic, and if you're watching this webinar, and I think it's safe to assume that you are, to check that out. And they are accepting public comments on that plan through May 26th. So again, if you're somebody who's interested in this topic and have any thoughts or ideas on that, you know, please do submit that. FX brought up some ideas for some immediate funding. I mentioned, you know, there are some of those federal grants out there available, and there is the Emergency Broadband Action Plan. Let me turn over to you, Jeremy, and basically thoughts on any of those topics, wide open. But basically, you know, the opportunities that are out there, the immediate term, and you know, in the 2 to 3 year term, because you know, FX brings up a good point. There's probably stuff that we can be doing right now. There's also stuff that we can be doing right now to get as much fiber built out and have people served by 2024 as possible. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's kind of two different approaches, two different things that we need to concern ourselves with now, and that's the, you know, what's the solution, you know, when kids go back to school in the fall if they still have to stay home? What's that sort of immediate response, that emergency response? And then what's the way that we can get to 2024 and have a reasonable chance of getting close to that goal of having everyone with symmetric 100 megabits per second? I'm not confident that we're going to get there, but I think we can get close. I think we can make the initial first steps. So rather than sort of going back over what FX was talking about, which I think he's right on all of those counts, I guess I can just talk about some of the different pools of money that we're looking at to fund what we're doing, rather than just the typical revenue bond that would be, I mean, absent other, you know, absent these loans or whatever, which is essentially what we would be looking at anyways. So as enabled by the legislature last year, there are loans available from VEDA, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, agency, whatever it is, in the amount of up to $4 million. But that requires a 10% match. So a $4 million project, $400,000 match. We're a bunch of volunteers. We don't have $400,000. We were trying our best to try to figure out ways to scrape that together. So we're looking at, you know, NBRC, the Northern Borders Regional Commission, has infrastructure funding. USDA Rural Development has some. The FCC has a what's called a reverse auction process to subsidize the build out of broadband infrastructure to unserved locations. The Economic Development Agency, and then we'll likely see from the state of Vermont some kind of COVID-related stimulus funds. So we're looking at all of that right now, and we're really just kind of hoping to get a kickstart, just kind of bootstrap funds here to get going. I think once we get going, we will hopefully be you know, have the momentum to keep going in the same way that ECFiber has, where we can sort of do you know, successive towns can, you know, building out the network further year after year with those revenue bonds, and essentially having our revenues cover the costs of continued investment from there.
Excellent. And you know, a lot of work going into trying to sort that all out and secure all that. So Evan, I imagine you're in a similar situation, and I want to go to you to hear about what Nek Community Broadband is doing and what they're looking at in terms of these funding opportunities. And then I think after that, we're going to open it up and go to the audience for some additional comments and questions, because I'm getting that some people are interested to weigh in here, which is excellent and great. But Evan, why don't you let us know about NEK and what's going on with that?
Yeah, so I think, out of the gate, we have almost all the same, our eyes on the same type of funding pools that CVFiber is looking at. Most immediate thing for us is the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. For our region specifically, there's $25 million in the initial census blocks, though I did hear that those the eligible blocks were updated, so that might go down in some way. But it's a pretty large amount of funding that would be available, and we think it would subsidize up to 20% of our network. So that would be a pretty large amount of funding for us to start out with. Also NBRC, also EDA's disaster relief, which has quite a bit of funding available, especially for our region. One thing else that I think we have that might be unique to some of the other UDs is we have 2 opportunity zones in our community. And so if you're not familiar with it, that's a capital gains kind of investment vehicle that would allow people to invest pretty substantial money into projects in these towns. So St. Johnsbury and Lyndonville are those 2 towns, but then a project can have up to 10% of the investment outside of those communities. So we see that as an opportunity to potentially accelerate some kind of side project that would maybe build simultaneously to some of the RDOF funding. We also think revenue bonds are absolutely something we would be taking advantage of after we have some track record. So, there's a lot of money, and potentially even more so in the next year if any of this kind of omnibus telecom bill gets through, and that would certainly fast track any type of bill that we want to do. But check back with us in a couple months. I think we'll have a better sense of where we are.
Yeah, and you mentioned, whether there's some kind of omnibus bill, as folks have mentioned here, there's been some money for, potentially broadband through the CARES Act, the money that's, come to the states, although it's questionable what that can be used for. I think FX mentioned that there might be some things that might be immediately of use, but I think, those of us in this world think it would be great to see, if the federal government has the stomach for it, stimulus with, real infrastructure spending in it, and not putting it through some of the existing programs or modifying those programs so that it's more easily accessible for entities on the ground, like the CUDs, to take advantage of and actually getting it to help people. So I know that's something VPIRG's been advocating for. Our federal delegation is fairly good on this issue. I shouldn't say fairly good, quite good. I mean, I know they really have been angling for more broadband funding, but what we can get out of the federal government is always an interesting question. So leaving that there for a second, I want to start to bring in some of the folks from the audience, and we'll start with Irv Tomei. Irv is the Government Relations Officer for ECFiber, the former chair of ECFiber, and one of the key players behind Act 79. I can vouch for that because I sat next to Irv in many a cramped committee meeting for much of last year as Act 79 was being debated and discussed, and he did help shepherd that through. So Irv, I'm going to bring you in, and I understand you have some comments and wisdom to lend to this discussion.
Well, I don't know if it's wisdom, but been through a lot of wars. I did want, coming back to one of the basic aspects of a CUD, I wanted to point out that although some people describe the fact that it's not funded from local taxes as a drawback, I think one of the greatest strengths of the CUD is that under Vermont law, it cannot be funded from property taxes. And if a CUD, I hate to bring up the concept, but if a CUD should fail, its problems cannot fall back on the lists of its member towns. They are insulated from its debt. It borrows against future revenues and pays its debts from customer service fees. And it's a regional body. And the benefit of that, if it had been possible to fund broadband, community broadband from local taxes, a very few towns across this state, including, frankly, the one I live in, Norwich, would have been all set many years ago, and our neighbors would have been no better off and probably worse off. The law against funding community broadband from local taxes was a very strong incentive for a group of communities to band together. That was the first point. The second point is somewhat related. The 10% match in Act 79 required to get the VEDA loan. And by the way, the concept of the VEDA loans is to get enough of a network built and producing some revenue that it gets to an established track record and then can go to the revenue bond market, which typically wants to see 3 years of audited financials. So how do you get there? And what about this 10% match? Well, I'd like to remind you about how ECFiber got going, because that initial funding step is the biggest challenge. It's true that our first step was unique. A small number of people wanted to fund a demonstration project. Well, there's only one demonstration project, but the next step can be emulated. We started offering promissory notes to interested residents and other people in small multiples of $2,500. Now, there are a lot of people across this state who don't think of themselves as wealthy, but could invest a $2,500 in unsecured loan at a relatively high interest rate over a period of maybe 15 years. And over the next few years, we got to where we had more than 450 distinct investors. And the median investment was $5,000. So most of these 450 people put in either $2,500 or $5,000. That can be replicated. And what I want to tell you today is that John Roy, he was a resident of Berkshire, he's our treasurer. He had a background in the financial services industry. He developed the mechanisms for monitoring these investments and tracking them, the spreadsheets and so on. And he told me recently, he no longer lives in Berkshire, he moved back to Boston. But he is willing to share with other CUDs how this was done, and he's even willing to share the spreadsheets that he developed for doing it. So this is a major potential boon, and I think I would counsel against the pessimism that says there's no way we can raise that 10%. I think it may be possible to raise that 10%. And there's many a town that has somebody who has quite a bit more money than he dresses at, if you get my meaning. So don't give up on that. That was the second point I wanted to make. I had a conversation today with one of the staffers in the Department of Public Service who's a rather bit pessimistic about, he says, the way the CARES Act is worded, it sounds good and it's very difficult to spend any of that money. But Congressman Peter Welch has introduced a bill in a bipartisan fashion in the House. He works with a coalition of other rural House members, many of whom are Republicans. So a bill that starts there has a better chance, one would hope, when it gets to the Republican-dominated U.S. Senate. And this is a bill for broadband build-out in rural areas across the country. Who knows what happens in Washington? But I'm at least as hopeful for that as I am for being able actually to use the CARES Act money right now.
Thanks for that, Irv. I heard don't give up and who knows what happens in Washington. And those are two, I think, sentiments that a lot of us share at the moment.
Also, you want to know more about how we raise that money privately. And over the course of a few years, we borrowed something like $5 or $6 million in small multiples from lots of people. We're willing to share that insight.
So hopefully, maybe offline after this. I mean, I know ECFiber is in contact with all of the CUDs, so it's not like this is like some initial introduction, but yeah, I mean, part of this is collaborating and hoping that folks can get together and share knowledge and do all of that. So really appreciate that. So we're coming up close to an hour, so I do want to say that if anybody in the audience has any questions or any thoughts they wanted to register, now would be the time to do it. You could chat it, and we'll read it, or if you want to ask the question, we can take you off mute. Otherwise, I'd like to just take the last 8 minutes or so here, maybe less, and just turn it over for final thoughts. So I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but again, feel free to chat those in if you have them. But otherwise, FX, Jeremy, and Evan, I would turn it over to each of you for just sort of final thoughts on this. And I guess, basically anything that's still on your mind that maybe we didn't address. And maybe, for folks who may be watching this who at the moment aren't necessarily involved with the CUD, but they tuned into this because they said, hey, I care about getting every Vermonter connected to the internet. I care about this issue. What can I do as an individual that could be helpful here? If you have any thoughts or anything that you would suggest to that person who's watching this right now, that would be great to share. So why don't we go with the order we started with, and why don't we start with FX, and we'll go down the line from there.
Yeah, we are going to need people who are skilled in putting wires on poles, in going out and collecting pole information, and we are going to, I believe, see some kind of training efforts starting very soon. And if you are a person who is interested in tramping around on the woods and driving around Vermont, and you've got confidence in your math skills and your ability to run an iPhone, I believe you're qualified. And this is very rewarding and interesting work that needs to be done in many places in Vermont. That's number one. Number two, if you yourself, or if you know of people who are passed by ECFiber or any other broadband service provider, and one of the reasons they do not take the service is because they cannot afford the conduit, you need to let that provider know that you are in that situation. Or you need to let the Public Service Department of Vermont know that you are in that situation. I believe that that's something that we might be able to do some things with immediately. Third, if you're not in that situation and we could just string a wire to your house, or somebody could just string a wire to your house, but you haven't been able to afford it, and you've got children in school, or you work in the healthcare industry, or any of the other businesses where your work and your income, or your children's education, or the education of others is important, you need to let the Public Service Department know, because there's going to be money to help with that. So that would be my message to the audience is, if you're in any of those situations, if you know about any of those situations, then please reach out.
Excellent, and thank you so much, FX, for everything you shared today. Really appreciate that. Jeremy, go to you.
So yeah, echoing what FX said, if you're in a town that's served by a communications union district, reach out to us. Let us know that you're interested, especially if you're definitely interested in signing up for service. We want to hear from you. We put out a survey last year and earlier this year to gauge community interest, but it's always good to hear from people, so kind of understand where those folks are. But also, if you're on the opposite side of the spectrum from what FX was talking about, and you want to invest like Irv was talking about, we'd also love to talk to you. So I mean, this is not something. I mean, if you want to simply donate, that's great. We can use that as well. It's tax deductible. But if you wanted to invest and get a reasonable rate of return, that's a possibility too. I'm also posting something that the Vermont Public Service Department put up on their website. This is an interactive broadband map that, according to their data, will show address by address what sort of internet coverage you're supposed to be having. And I would say for everybody watching this, anybody that has an internet connection or is interested in this topic, just go there, find your address, and then take the little survey that's attached to every address. This will tell the Public Service Department, do you actually get 25.3 there? There's a lot of addresses that say, you get this, and the reality on the ground is that you don't. Maybe it's better than what's listed there, but fill that survey out and make yourself known. I will also post into the chat, once I can find the URL, the list and the map of all of the communications union districts in the state of Vermont. And if you're in a place that does not show a communications union district, you should talk to the Public Service Department, Rob Fish. Talk to Rob Fish at the Public Service Department and get a CUD started. There's going to be resources and help for you to get that going if you're not under the umbrella of one of us here. That's all I got.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Jeremy's posting those links that he mentioned in the Zoom chat. For anyone who's watching on Facebook, we will take the same links and we'll get them in the comments of that Facebook post. So anybody who's watching it right now or coming to this video later, we'll be posting that. And yes, absolutely, if you can take the survey, that's great. I mean, it's basically being spread through word of mouth. So folks watching this, please do that. And Evan, what are your final bits of wisdom for us as we look to wrap up here today?
I mean, I don't have very much, because I think FX and Jeremy really covered the bulk of anything I could have said. But I think, when it comes to the NEK, we have a lot of towns that are more rural than even where I am in Sutton. And our goal is to get everyone connected here. And we know that most of these communities are going to be left behind if we don't connect them into a CUD or into a community-led effort. And so it's really just a call out to those communities to ask them if they are unserved and would like to be served, to reach out to us, and we'll figure out how to get your community involved and get you added to our CUD or into another CUD that might be more appropriate. And yes, always open and interested in investment opportunities for the CUD. So hopefully we'll be lucky enough to be receiving some level of funds that can help accelerate our CUD efforts and bring fiber to every home.
Excellent. That's the name of the game, fiber to every home. I again want to thank you all for coming on and joining us today, and also thank you, for the service, that you're providing and the work that you're all doing. So it's inspirational to me. I mean, I would say, it's so great that here in Vermont we got people on the ground dedicated to doing this, and VPIRG wants to be as supportive as we possibly can, and I know, I will speak, for our membership, that, the feedback we've gotten, people all across the state, those who are served and those who aren't served, want to see this happen and want to be supportive of that. So thanks again, and really appreciate it, and best of luck to all of you going forward in this endeavor.
All right. Thanks for putting this together, Zach.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you very much.